We face critical challenges in racial equity and human rights, but we also have an opportunity to advance justice and liberation. So tonight we wanted to invite Juanita Tamayo Lott, Penny Nakatsu, and Laureen Chew to talk about their experience during the strikes and also share the wisdom as we march forward in the front lines. So first I'd introduce each one of them. I'll give them, read their bios. So Laureen Chew was born in San Francisco to a Chinese-American father and a Chinese immigrant mother. During her college years, Laureen volunteered and worked short-term jobs in SF's Chinatown to help immigrant students, pre-delinquent teenage girls, and at-risk youth. At San Francisco State, she was arrested during the 1968 Third World Liberation Front student strike and spent 21 days in jail for her support in the struggle to establish the College of Ethnic Studies. As president of the Association of Chinese Teachers, she forged alliances to form the powerful ethnic minority educators, which fought layoffs of minority teachers. Laureen later received her education from a doctorate of education from the University of the Pacific, and in 1980, she joined the Faculty of Asian American Studies at SF State. She served as department chair of elementary education from 2001 to 2006, and in 2006, Laureen returned full-time to the College of Ethnic Studies as Associate Dean. In 2017, she retired as Emeritus Faculty in Asian American Studies. Thank you, Laureen.
Hi.
Next to her is Penny Nakatsu, is a veteran of the 1968-1969 Third World Liberation Front Black Student Union strike at SF State. During 1972, she was a volunteer law clerk here at the Asian Law Caucus at our office in Oakland on Park Boulevard. She is retired and has practiced law at the Legal Aid Society of Alameda County, the Employment Law Center, and several public agencies, most recently as a Deputy General Counsel at the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, where she focused on public finance, land use, and good government matters. And we have Juanita Tamayo Lott, a retired senior federal demographer statistician with management and advisory positions at the U.S. Department of Health, Education and Welfare, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the U.S. Census Bureau, and the Smithsonian Institute. In 1975, she served on the Federal Interagency Committee on Education Working Group that developed the racial and ethnic categories for the federal statistical system. She is the author of Asian Americans from Racial Category to Multiple Identities, Common Destiny, Filipino American Generations, Filipinos in Washington, D.C. with Law Caucus, and the forthcoming Golden Children, The Legacy of Ethnic Studies and SF State. She holds degrees from SF State and the University of Chicago. Let's please all welcome our panelists. So I'd like to start the Q&A with a question to Juanita because she was interviewed in the film. So from the film Agents of Change, we have a glimpse of what the political moment was like at that time. The civil rights movement and the protests against the Vietnam War. But I was wondering actually, what was the political moment in your perception, in your point of view?
Thank you, Paul. I want to say thank you to everybody who's been here, the caucus, the fellow strikers, and the young people, and everybody in between. So thank you. The political moment, well, I think the whole thing was a political moment. And I have to say that it was due to three men in my life and two schools. The three men were my father, Lázaro Lorenzo Tamayo, and my uncle, Pablo Placido, who were involved in the union movement in the 1930s and the 1940s in Hawaii and California. And Bill Fonasher, my brother Bill Tamayo's godfather, who was very involved in looking at colonialism in the Philippines because he was putting together the independence of the Philippines from the United States. And then the two schools were Morningstar School. Some of you went to Morningstar School, I hope, here in Japantown. And the people there, the priests and the nuns, they supported the Japanese American community and rallied up against the internment. The second school was Mercy High School, where I learned from my Jewish history teacher about the Japanese internment program, and also Sister Kathleen Maria, who taught us the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. So I was ready to go to San Francisco State.
And to Penny, somewhat similar question. So the strikes were 4 months long. What motivated you? What inspired you to stay in the struggle? And did you have any doubts as an Asian American?
Well, I want to emphasize that to this day, the strike is the longest strike that occurred on campus, number one. Number two, it was not an isolated event. The decision to strike by the BSU and the TWLF was a decision born by, after years of trying to negotiate amicably, an amicable resolution with the administration for the development of a autonomous Black Studies department, for the admission of more Black students on campus. Those efforts were stymied. They were stymied. The strike began in November of 1968. So that was the beginning of the fall semester of 68. The semester before, in the spring of 1968, there were several actions which were preludes to the strike. One was a joint demonstration to try to get ROTC, as we used to say, off campus, and it was also combined with a demand that 400 minority students, particularly Black students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, be admitted to the college. I will point out that this concept of a special admissions program wasn't something that we dreamed up. For several years, the San Francisco State Administration, probably all of the San Francisco State colleges, the college presidents have the discretion, the ability to waive academic requirements for up to 2% of the student population. In 1968, the population at San Francisco State was 18,000. Well, prior to 1968, the special admissions process had been used primarily to admit, for instance, athletes, and very few, if any, I believe, any minority students or economically disadvantaged students were beneficiaries of that program. So that was one of the things that the BSU and the other third world groups were trying to change. So in the spring of 68, there were several demonstrations to try to get the SF State administration to commit to bringing on 400 Black students onto campus. That didn't happen. Also, there were ongoing negotiations between the BSU and San Francisco State for the formation of an autonomous Black Studies department. At that particular point in time, there were Black Studies classes that had been offered and were being offered through the experimental college and to some extent in various departments of the school. But there was no independent recognition for a Black Studies program. So that was going on. So the strike was a response to the administration's failure to address these requests. Initially, there were requests. When the administration kept stalling, kept trying to basically come up with lukewarm solutions, the BSU said, we have no choice, we have got to go on strike. November 6th, 1968 was the day the strike began. And the other third world organizations at San Francisco State, many of whom had been formed relatively recently, also participated in the strike. Thus, the 10 demands of the BSU became the 10 demands of the BSU and the 5 demands of the TWLF. all of which were addressed to the formation of an autonomous program of ethnic studies, the retention of faculty that who had been dismissed, and the development of a meaningful program of ethnic studies. One of the things you saw in the film were several interviews with one of the black instructors who had actually been hired by the school to teach English composition to incoming freshmen to prepare them for college work, because this was part of the strategy. If many of the students that we were trying to recruit came from schools where they had not been given appropriate education and were less equipped to participate. So all of these things were going on. So the strike is part of a process. It's part of a larger setting that includes the Vietnam War. We were 10 years into a Vietnam War. It includes the fact that we were at a time where probably very few people in this room know about the draft. All young men, when they turned 18, were supposed to register with their local selective service board. However, there was a provision that allowed college students in good standing to be exempt from selective service. So it's not an accident that a disproportionate number of poor black and brown students in particular were not only drafted because they could not take advantage of these exemptions, they didn't have powerful friends, and many of those brothers died. So lots of folks were involved in the struggle, and at times I may have wavered, but with all that support, I had to go on.
Similar question to Laureen. What motivated you, but also how did you see the Asian American community come together? Or was it just disparate groups or individuals that were there? Yeah, could you describe that scene, that moment?
That moment? How many moments were there? Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take as to why I got involved in the strike. Maybe I got involved because I was pissed. I was angry at 18 years old. And what was bad about that anger, not bad about the anger, it was like, what is it? It's like, who do I blame for hating who I am? Okay, because I grew up in Chinatown, and it was a very kind of sheltered and closed cultural enclave. You know, I was fine. My parents loved me and whatever, and I went to all the right schools in Chinatown, and I went from public school to a Catholic school in Chinatown, and I never had any problems making friends or fitting in. But high school, my mother, in her infinite wisdom of being a sewing factory lady that didn't speak a lick of English, sent me to Notre Dame de Victoire, which is a French school at the end of Chinatown, because it was not too far away. And her whole reasoning was that she didn't want me to go to Gal, thinking that if I went to Galileo, I would just be derailed into being, I don't know what, a delinquent. Whatever the gossip in the sewing factory was, she kind of like, because she was Catholic, she was going to do me right. Now, Catholic school at that time, for me, I was one of 3 Chinese, and I had the most horrible time fitting in. And I never had that problem, you know, prior to that, and because they were basically they were basically Chinese kids, you know, it didn't matter in Chinatown. And to have people suddenly, okay, first of all, I was not the smartest Chinese, probably not the smartest, period. Secondly, I was not athletic, so none of the white girls would ask me for anything, to be on the sports team or for help for homework. So I was left pretty much like, hi, I'm Laureen, and they're pretty much like, yeah. You know how mean high school can be. Okay, so, and I didn't really understand it, and I couldn't verbalize it because I was never taught the word race. I was never taught the word racism at home nor at school, correct? So I had no label. I only had a label for misery. And I remembered asking my mom to transfer me out. And her whole thing is, are you crazy? You're not going to school to party, to socialize. You're going to school to learn. And you're going to be a Catholic girl, so just leave it alone. So I didn't want to go to San Francisco State. I actually wanted to leave town, but, because we didn't have money, and I don't think I had the her grades, and so her thing was that, good girls stay home. So I stayed home and went to San Francisco State. For 2 years, from 66 to 68, I was cool. I tried to join the Chinese American clubs there, and they were like, all they wanted to do was party or find a husband or get engaged or whatever it was. I mean, not that I wasn't interested, it was just like, not quite yet, right? And so I think one day there was another Chinese American girl. She came in to the library and she said, we were working together, there's this meeting, and you talked about how these girls treated you really nasty in high school. A lot of these people have similar experience. I said, really? Other Chinese people had it? Oh no, they're not Chinese. They're black, they're Latino, they're Mexicans, they're American Indians. I said, oh, okay, I'll go, right? It was actually the convocation. I think it was in 60. I can't remember dates. Sorry, we have Dan Gonzalez there, Rich Wada, and all these people.
End of November 68.
Okay. She's the lawyer, so she has great. So I went, and then Eldridge Cleaver was there, wasn't he?
Yes.
And boy, was I like, whoa, I like that man. He said exactly a lot of things that I felt. And the thing that was really interesting is that prior to that experience, if I didn't like myself for who I was, whether it was because I didn't have the right racial uniform that Ron Takaki always referred to, I was not white, and I went to this predominantly white school, and the whole part of who do I blame for not fighting back? I didn't blame anybody but my parents and my ethnicity. It was because I was Chinese because Chinese people don't talk back. And a good child is a quiet child. An obedient child is what all the teachers loved about teaching Chinese kids. They're so good. And when busing happened, they all went apeshit. It's oh my God. You know what I'm saying? All these kids don't come. That's another story. But what's interesting is that the thing that I knew that hit a chord was when I went to college was an education, or the lack thereof, about who we are and how we have not been valued in terms of our contributions to this part of the United States, much less the whole US of A, as Asian Americans, was so lacking that so many of us of generations previous to that felt that it was our fault that anything bad happened to us. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, you don't correct somebody outside, you correct yourself. And it creates a form of self-hatred that we're not even aware of, And so I think because of that kind of experience, and when I heard people like Eldridge Cleaver, then of course, in 63, I heard Martin Luther King on TV, and he spoke truth to power also. And I related to that. And my mom, who did not speak any English, never understood why I kept on watching black people on TV. You know what I mean? And her whole thing was like, why are you listening to them? Why aren't you listening to the, white folks? Because they weren't that interesting, to me, in terms of how I felt about who I am. So, for me to get into the strike was a no-brainer. I was so pissed off. I was so angry. I wanted to channel it somehow. I wanted to still be optimistic. I'm only 18 years old. I didn't want to, you know what I mean? I had a long life ahead of me. Kind of a bummer to be really pissed off for the rest of your life. So I think that, the whole idea that we will take the curriculum and design it how we see fit. The whole issue of self-determination, determining who we are with our voice, was totally unheard of. And we had the audacity And how do you say? Well, we didn't say things really nicely back then. You know, and we didn't, when we disagreed with somebody, we would say, fuck you. You know what I mean, we didn't like the Board of Education that went to Commodore Stockton and Board of J. Lau. As a student, I went with all these little gang kids who were immigrant kids, and every time anyone spoke, they said, fuck you. You know, you didn't give us any, I can't speak English, what's the matter with you? You know, that kind of thing. And then after that, there was a huge riot in Chinatown. I wish someone filmed that one, because we never had one after that. Too bad. You know, just because sometimes that belly under the fire is what makes us, how do you say, powerful, whether you want to rein it in on certain times or let it loose at other times. And I think the San Francisco State Strike, sorry, I'm taking a long time, was a perfect vehicle for those of us who just came out of exclusion and didn't exactly know where we fit, and also without previous history.
So Juanita, I'd like to ask how your parents felt about your activism and just talk about activism in general at that time. Like, where was that fire for you?
Well, my parents supported us. I mean, we met at my parents' house because my dad comes from a union background. My mom was also a leader, and I mean, Danny can testify to this. All the meals my mom cooked for the planning committee, for the strike committee. I guess I was very lucky. But I also wanted to say that I went to City College before I transferred to San Francisco State, and I was involved in the tutoring program there, and the people who were involved there were the Black Panthers. The leader of the Black Panther that I met was an Asian, was Mu Ning. So I had all this stuff going for me.
And to Penny, we saw that you were on the documentary as well, a photo of you, and you were right there on the front lines. What was your role? What was your role then, and what do you think your role now, when you look back on it? What do you think your role was? I don't know if that makes sense. But.
I started at San Francisco State in the fall of '68. I grew up in San Francisco. And I started hanging out at the, we used to call them huts. They were Quonset huts that housed the...
You saw that in the film.
Experimental College, also the offices of the BSU. And I got involved in the sit-ins in the spring of '68. And I started looking around for an organization that I could affiliate myself with. And at that particular time, the spring of '68, the only third world organizations other than the BSU were LASO, the Latin American Student Organization, ICSA, the Intercollegiate Chinese for Social Action, and PACE, the Filipino Americans Collegiate Endeavor. And there were social organizations, I believe, but I wasn't interested in that. Coincidentally, in the summer of '68, well, so there was no group that I felt I could affiliate with. So I just started hanging out with all of these other groups, trying to learn as much as I can, and that's how I started getting involved. In the summer of '68, I found out about a meeting of Asians that was taking place in Berkeley, a political action group of Asian Americans. That group eventually became APA, the Asian American Political Association. I found out about that from another San Francisco State student, Masayo Suzuki. So I remember we went over to Berkeley. We met other students, primarily students at Berkeley. So when the fall of '68 started and we went back to campus, we decided to form an APA chapter at San Francisco State. So because there were other third world groups already in existence, many of the folks who were attracted to APA were either Japanese American, because there was no Japanese American political group, or other Asian Americans who were more interested in a more political agenda. We were not a social service organization. What we were interested in was political education, political action, ending the silence. One of the things that really bothered me was the fact that there seemed to be so few Asian Americans who spoke out, who you could see involved in the civil rights movement. And in fact, there were many individual Asian Americans, but very few Asian American organizations. So we saw APA as a vehicle that could make that change. I participated in the strike primarily as a member of APA and as one of APA's 2 representatives to the TWLF Central Committee. So,
And to Laureen, you talked about the lack of participations by Asian American groups. If you could give us a sense of what were the struggles, other struggles within organizing and maybe working with other groups of people.
Well, you know, there's a lot of levels of what we would define as different people. Okay. For myself, rediscovering my community, even though I grew up here, was one thing when I was during the strike. Many of us who were involved in the strike that were Chinese and Chinese American were not exactly welcomed in the mainstream Chinatown community. You know, I'll be very honest, right? I mean, some of the people felt that we were like lunatics, militant, basically like troublemakers. Okay, so that's one group of people that we were identified as, and yet we still wanted to, quote unquote, help in the community. Then there's the other piece in terms of working with people on campus. I was not as involved in that, okay? I felt that what was interesting about the strike that totally redefined what curriculum should be at a college level is that your coursework should be tied to the work you do in the community, you know, of which, unfortunately, I hate to say, is no longer even really dealt with, nor as robust as what it used to be. But so my whole intent, if I was going to, you know, I mean, my role in the strike at San Francisco State was to agitate. Anytime I get to agitate something, like do something naughty, I would love to go into it. And I'm not going to list what it is. But in Chinatown, you know, most of our time was spent in Chinatown trying to work in different things. Like for myself, I was interested in tutoring, okay, immigrant kids, because that in '66 was when the liberalization of immigration laws happened, right? So we had this influx of immigrant kids that we had never seen, and they were not doing well in school, and the teachers didn't know how to deal with them. So, I mean, that was my call. You know, I loved it. But then also, it was also a time where this community was switching over from the Chinese 6 companies being the power people, you know, the people who negotiated with City Hall, the people, you know, the politicians recognized, and moving towards something new. Okay, which is what it is now, run by agencies, you know, like Asian Law Caucus, like CAA, like Self-Help for the Elderly. In the late 60s, those entities did not exist, you know. So people like ourselves had to kind of figure out how we were going to part of this whatever new guard was going to be in terms of curriculum, in terms of being part of the new Chinatown power structure. And I think for those who finished San Francisco State, you know, what the strike did is that we knew for sure, I think all of us, that our call was to make sure our community, what we contributed was not going to be something that would shortchange our community,
Sure.
you know? So we wanted to, quote unquote, represent at some level what our community needed. And that whole shift from 6 companies to community agencies because of the war on poverty was a huge thing, you know, for the college students to kind of get their hands on.
Juanita.
I wanted to give a different take. I grew up in the Fillmore, Japantown, and so to me, people were black, people were brown, people were red, people were mixed. because all the World War II veterans brought home their war bribes. The American Indian community, the policy of the United States was to urbanize the American Indians. So San Francisco was the center. There was a vibrant Japanese community, a vibrant Latino community, a vibrant Filipino community. And I want to talk a little bit about the Filipino community because I think we played a pivotal role. We kept everybody together because some of us we're mestizo, we're mulatto. Some of us are black Filipino, some of us are white Filipino, some of us are Latino Filipino, or American Indian Filipino. And that's who PACE was, the Filipino American Collegiate Endeavor. And I was really flabbergasted because, I come from a very privileged group, and the Filipino guys I saw really weren't what I considered college material. I'm sorry, Danny. There was SI, there's St. Ignatius and Mercy High School, okay? But the Filipino community, they're in the Mission, they're in Bernal Heights, they're in the Fillmore. They're the guys that are being drafted to Vietnam, and that's why I went to work with Manuel de Fontorum, I went to work with Patrick Salaver, Orvi Hundis, to talk to the kids in Bernal Heights, to talk to the kids in South of Mission about, hey, you just came from the Philippines, and they're going to ship you back to Vietnam. And so I got really involved in that. But to see people like Ron Kitachai, Bob Illumin, Alex Soria, the guys who founded PACE, say we can take our destiny in our hands. And a lot of our fathers had been involved, not just in the Union movement, but had served the United States in the military. So, and then we also come from the Catholic Church. So what we had in the Filipino community going for us, besides being mixed, we have the most beautiful children, basically, is that we had three institutions, legitimating institutions of power. The Catholic Church, the military, and then because we were a colony of the United States, we understood how to play that 1965 Immigration Act game.
So you've mentioned, the panelists have mentioned that the strikes actually helped the formation of community groups and organizations. And I'm actually very curious, maybe I'll turn this question to Penny. How did these strikes and your participation in it affect your trajectory in life? Like becoming a lawyer, etc. How did that affect you?
Well, one thing I want to point out is the strike got settled on March 23rd, 1969. Surprise, the School of Ethnic Studies was to open for class in fall of 1969. There was no curriculum. In many cases, there were no texts. So the actual curriculum of ethnic studies, the ethnic studies program, was actually put together by committees. Committees of students, supportive third world faculty already on campus, and the community. So that's one of the things that I got involved in. I did not, however, see myself as staying on within the becoming an academic or teaching, but I felt a keen need to develop some skills that could be useful to bring about social change. I dare say that if I had not been involved in the strike, my life trajectory would have been very different. One of the things that occurred for me during the strike was, in many ways, I found my voice, and I was encouraged to do something I'd never even thought about, which is go to law school. So I went to law school, and I was involved with the crew of law students. We were law students who formed the Asian Law Caucus. Our first office was a storefront in East Oakland. So the Asian Law Caucus is an example, I think, of the kind of community organization that grew out of the spirit of the strike. Another example is, we have here Carla Matsushita, who was and remains the guiding force behind the Japanese American Library, a community nonprofit organization that will celebrate its 50th anniversary next year. So he is an example of someone in the community who formed an organization really to carry on the spirit and the work that the strike was meant to foster. I can give you more examples, but time does not permit.
I'd like to give one example, and that is the International Hotel. That comes out of the work of San Francisco State. It comes out also UC Berkeley and other folks. And I wanted to acknowledge Estela Habal, professor at San Jose State, who wrote the book on the International Hotel. But if it wasn't for our 9-unit community curriculum course, and we have that at least in all the Asian American studies, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, that you had to go out and do work in the community. And we had people like Bullet Marasigan, Joaquin Legaspi, Jovina Navarro, who was one of our first professors at San Francisco State, and she developed that curriculum. And of course, because Manila Town is right next to Chinatown, and a lot of us who came out of the strike also were in Japantown, there was a natural coalition and coherence among the groups. I mean, we were lucky because we did call each other brothers and sisters, and not just among the Asians, but because a lot of us grew up, as I say, in the Fillmore, in the Western Addition, and we come from interracial families.
And to shift the conversation a little bit to Laureen, I went to grad school for Asian American Studies, so I'm going to ask this question: how does the strike shape the formation of the Asian American identity?
Well, I certainly hope it benefits in terms of not having the thought that the only way we can fit in this country is to assimilate. I hate that word. Because if you really study assimilation, it basically means that, let's say A is white, B is whatever, and C is something else. A, B, and C are people of color. The aspiration for assimilation is to be A, okay? To be A meaning to be white, to be part of the power. And in many ways, it's dictated by things like language and then your values, right? I think Asian American Studies, what's interesting that even before I retired last year, I visited some of the classes, and one thing has not changed for our students in terms of why they're taking these classes. And that is the whole question of who they are, who they are as one form, shape of Asian American, and how they fit in this society in terms of how they respond to certain issues. And it's a little more complicated for Asians in America now because it's moved very far from what it was to what it is now. I mean, now you have Asians suing places like what, Yale? Because other students, Harvard? See, I get them all mixed up. I really,
They're all the same.
Suing them because they're allowing other students of color in before them, of which they are, the Asians feel they're much more qualified. That is something I totally do not understand. I do not understand, and I don't care how you explain it to me. My whole thing is that too many of us, and this is what I call the system's fault, as well as maybe some of us, we have not taught enough as to who paid what price for not having anything before us. Right? Wow. And this whole thing, and it shifted mainly because if you really look at it, in 66 is the beginning of the onslaught of much more Asian Americans coming to this country. And it's interesting how our curriculum, no matter how much we fought for it, and it's at the college level, San Francisco State's College of Ethnic Studies is still the only College of Ethnic Studies in the entire nation.
In the world.
Well, some people disagree with that, the world. So I'm not going to talk about the world. I will talk about this little nation we live in, okay? It's ridiculous. And so, many of the other programs like Texas basically outlawed it, or Arizona, they say you do this, you will lose your teaching license, et cetera, et cetera. So we're becoming very, very small in terms of our message. And what's really alarming is that none of our curriculum in terms of accuracy and contribution and more complex thinking about history infiltrated, wrong word, I mean, went to the K-12 system. Okay? It's not an accident that Middle America thinks the way it does. It's not an accident that Californians, North and South, or whatever, think the way they don't think. You know, so our curriculum has not been well distributed within the K-12 system, which is, I think, is still a struggle. Did I answer the question? I'm getting old, you know.
To this day, being what is Asian America, what is Asian American remains a concept, a political concept particularly. It can be approached on a number of levels as a catch-all description that takes in the diaspora of those of us whose forebears came from different parts of Asia. But for me, being Asian American is still a political ideal. It's a goal. In 1968, people didn't use the term Asian American. We were all Orientals or Chinks, no matter what our ethnicity was. Historically, we have been subject to a divide and conquer. For instance, in World War II, when 120,000 Japanese Americans largely were incarcerated by the United States government, it forced many people in the Chinese community, in an effort to protect themselves, to put out signs that says, "I am not Japanese, I am Chinese." So utilizing and promoting the term Asian American was a way to take back our power, and it remains a way to take back our power. It does not mean that we ignore the difference between the various ethnic communities that make up Asian America. What it does mean that in the larger context, our destinies are joined. We have been in the past, and we will continue to be seen largely by the powers that be as by color, without differentiation. And we can't affect necessarily directly how other people see us, but what we can do is take back our story and tell our story.
I'd like to do it from a federal statistical point of view. My last job when I retired from Washington, D.C. was planning the 2010 census. As you all know, the 2020 census is on everybody's minds. I was lucky enough, and I think there must have been somebody, a guardian angel, because I was able, after the strike, some of us even graduated on time, huh, Danny? We graduated on time. We even graduated cum laude. And then what happened is these universities came after us, these elite universities. They came and recruited us because you know what they were smart enough to say? The people from Cornell, the people from Columbia, the people from Chicago, the people from Brown, you know, all these east of the Mississippi folks, but of course also Stanford and the UC system. They said, you know, if you are going to make trouble, we'd rather have you in the system than outside the system so we can watch you. A lot of us got to graduate school that way, and to law school and to medical school. It's also true of women, but that's happened all the time in the United States. There's always been a quota of a few people. They let a few women, a few non-white men go in. So that, you know, this is American democracy, right? So I went to the University of Chicago, which is a very prestigious university. And I was in the School of Sociology, Survey Research, Computer Science, which was really wild because in 1971, there weren't that many Asian women, American women, there were Asians in, like, you know, even the social sciences, but certainly not in computer sciences and not in quantitative stuff. I was lucky enough that I got mentored Phil Hauser, Donald Bogue, and they showed me this book called the 1960 Census. And it had a special issue of Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino. And I go, what? There aren't that many Japanese, Chinese, and Filipinos in 1960. They've been tracking us since we first landed. You know, we come and look into the historical census, and you know why they're tracking us? You know why they're tracking us?
No, tell me.
Because there used to be this card, this postcard that my mom filled out. It's called the immigration card. Every year, if you were not an American citizen, if you were an immigrant, you had to tell the U.S. government where you lived. And that's really recent. Because I remember going down to the post office on Geary and Steiner and watching my mom fill out that card as a little kid every year, because she was not an American citizen. She refused to give up her Philippine citizenship when she came to the U.S., but my dad made her change her mind. So, but for a while, so they're tracking us. And I say that because I was lucky enough to serve on the committee, Federal Interagency Committee on Education, because the Californians were smart. We knew society wasn't black, American society wasn't black, white, and other. But it had to be the folks who came out of west of the Mississippi who had to show them that, you know, we were all these different kinds of people. And I was lucky enough to serve on that committee in 1975 because, you know, you just go to the grammar schools and, you know, and kindergarten, and you know who's going to be a citizen or who's going to be in the labor force 20 years, right? It's pretty straightforward, demography is. That's why I went into demography. It's also numbers. But what I want to get to you is that we were able to fight for Asian and Pacific Islanders to be in the federal statistical system. And the census is the linchpin of the federal statistical system. And there was one Asian, one Latino, a couple of blacks, and the rest were whites. But they understood. And we were able to get the Asian numbers on there, not just Filipino, not just Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, which were the historical groups that had immigrated earlier, and a few Asian Indians, but because the Vietnam War ended, right? And they had to keep track of all the refugees. And that's why when people say, how come Asians are all over the place? It's because who started that war? And who brought in all these refugees? Duh. So to me, I come from an Asian American concept from a statistical basis and the federal statistical system, because that's the legitimating institution of power. And moreover, if you aren't if you aren't officially counted, you don't exist. And the thing is, you can track it over time so that you can see who the different cohorts, who the different generations, who the different groups are, and whether they came because of an immigration policy, because of a war, or something else.
Wow. So I want to pose the last question, and I wanted to bring us back to the current moment. Well, first I just want to recognize that we have three amazing and diverse panelists, women of color up here. Filipino American, Japanese American. I hope the optics here also inspire you. But my last question is, before we turn it to the audience, what is resonating today from the strikes, or what are the lessons that you learned that we can apply today in the movements that are happening?
A people united can never be defeated.
One of the most important things about the strike was it was not just about protest. It was protest with a purpose to bring together a program of action. So in any political movement, it has to be more than speaking out, speaking against, telling your truth. It also has to have a viable program. So, and what we see today is that there are many organizations that can be traced in one way or another to not just the San Francisco State strike, but all of the other third world rebellions on campuses. and programs, organizations that have and continue to do good work. And that must continue. What's the question?
What did you learn from the strikes and be applied today?
Well, I think what's interesting is actually this has been the best group I've come to and talked with in a long time. I haven't felt comfortable, kind of reminiscing and then feeling like not feeling dated and whatever. Maybe because I see a lot of friends out there that are my age group. Like Steve Wong. I mean, it's really nice. And I think, because I don't live in Chinatown anymore and I come here very infrequently, except to maybe my joke or something like that. So it's kind of strange, But when I was here during the 60s and when I taught at Gordon J. Lau for a couple of years as a bilingual teacher, one of the things I felt that was really productive was that we had some kind of community newspaper. There was a San Francisco Journal, I think Rich Wada and Rita, those guys were there. There was East West, there was Asian Week, besides from the Chinese newspapers, right? And those newspapers had reporters, and so they would go around and talk to different people about different issues. And so if you're not you don't belong to one group, you actually had the vehicle by which to be informed about how the other groups are doing and what they're doing, and be, kind of like part of the community again. You know what I'm saying? Now everybody seems to be in their own silo. And it's not, that's just my perception, because I don't live in Chinatown proper. I can't pick up anything. I'm not in anybody's network. But it's like everyone does his own thing as an agency, it appears, and it's not that it shouldn't. But I wonder, like, as a member of the Association of Chinese Teachers, we worked with CAA, Chinese for Affirmative Action, when there were teacher layoffs, okay? And then we would maybe work with the housing people to make sure our students, were quote-unquote living in decent places and stuff. So, there was kind of those other connections. And if that's happening, forgive me for even mentioning it, but if it's not happening, can someone figure it out? How to do so that people are more connected, so we feel more like a community. That's what I'm saying, because that's what I got out of the strike. To be a community that's not always about me, but is about we. And that is still the motto I live by, and I try to live it. Well, not now. I'm real selfish now. I just like to be in my PJs all day and watch TV. I stopped working, but I'm just saying that, it's something that's very simple, but we worked really hard to be like that, and I hope that we continue to do so, because I'll say one thing. What was nice about the strike is that it gave you a sense of optimism, even though you were pissed off every day, because you know why? This is kind of the only country where it's still an experiment in many, many ways, in terms of our voices, in terms of being equal to each other, and it's not done. And San Francisco is getting to be a really strange place. When I go to Tartine and somebody looks at me and I could speak English and say, "Oh, where did you learn your English? What about being born here?" But my whole thing is that she's not from here. So I'm being reminded of places I was at in '68 when I went to DC, where someone asked me the same question, right? And the thing that really got me was that I only recently found out that my grandmother was born in California in 1870. Wow. I thought she came with my grandfather from China. But I had to sit down, because I wanted to tell those people, like, excuse me, how long have you been here? Where did you learn your English? Sorry.
it.